majestad y el bridor, y retiembla en sus centros la tierra al sonoro rugir del cañón. Y retiembla en sus centros la tierra al sonoro rugir del cañón.
Hola y bienvenidos to A Drink with the Past with your hosts,
Martín.
and Jose. Welcome to season 2 of the podcast. And by season 2, we mean just another year of continuing this project. On today's episode, we are drinking some Mondavi Chardonnay along with some Cayman Jack margarita as we travel to Mexico. So settle in and pour a drink of your choice as we say salud,
Salud.
to the past. Okay, so we're setting the scene to where in Mexico and what time?
So the time period that we are going to look at in Mexico is basically, or the topic we're going to look at is basically what's known as the Cristiada period, the Cristiada. Mm-hmm. All right, so this is basically like early 1900s, 1920s, right? And basically, I just want to talk about the basically the persecution that the Catholic Church was facing in 1920s Mexico.
Where in particular are we starting off? In what part of Mexico?
Well, first of all, we got to start off at the capital, Mexico City, and then work our way to, obviously, to the other areas of Mexico. But of course, everything has to start off with the capital.
Okay, so what exactly is happening in the capital in the, you said 1820s or
1920s. So what's happening in the capital is basically we have this president in 1924. This president comes to power known as Elias Plutarco Calles.
Okay, that name sounds familiar. I remember reading about Plutarco.
Calles, yeah. Elias Plutarco Calles. He's the president of Mexico, and he basically wants to implement the Constitution of 1917, specifically the anti-clerical laws that were written inside the Constitution. So basically, he was just putting it into action, just making sure it wasn't just written down on a paper and basically like forgotten all about it. He wants to implement the anti-clerical laws within Mexico.
Why does he feel it needs to be some anti-clerical laws in their constitution?
Well, he didn't feel like it. It was already put in place in 1917, but obviously it goes way back into the 19th century as well. But basically, Mexico was just trying to fully gain the constitutional republic that it was supposed to be, basically, especially with the separation of church and state.
Wasn't that always a thing in Mexico before this constitution was set in place?
To be honest, not really, not so much. Yeah, they did put it like in paper, but it wasn't enforced. It wasn't implemented because back then the Catholic Church did have a say within the Mexican government on certain issues, like mainly social issues and about how to try people right in the courts and who's allowed certain privileges. Well, not who's allowed certain privileges, but how certain people can be tried and basically what people are supposed to like learn in school and how they're supposed to be educated. So basically the church was like involved in a lot of the things in social life in Mexico before, the official implementation of the separation between church and state in the 20th century eventually.
So why did the church itself, how did the church allow itself to be immersed into the Mexican government like that, to have more of a say? Was it always like that, or did someone just fully say, you know what, they're part of this, they're part of this country. We should at least have them be equals in what the government has to say.
It's because it's religion. Basically, the Catholic Church was considered like the established religion of Mexico, and of course, many of the leaders are devout Catholics back then. Like they were devout Catholics. They always go to. Sometimes they go ask the advice of like the bishops or like or priests, possibly in some cases. But of course, the leaders try to do everything by themselves, like amongst each other. But of course, when it comes to things like religion, then the church basically goes in and becomes like a guidance for the government per se, and trying to do what's right, but also making sure that the church maintain their lands as well.
So in order for them to have their lands and stuff, they have to be a part of they have to be involved in politics at that point.
I would say they would have to get on the good side of like the politicians, I guess you could say. Okay. Because in any case, the politicians could basically take away the church's lands, because of course you're going to have the examples of what was happening in France, of course, with the French Revolution. But other than that, it's everything before the Constitution of 1917, or like before the 1920s, the church was like involved in a lot of things, right? And we could actually see that even during the colonial period, the church had control of some aspect of life within Mexico when it was still part of Spain, when it was still a colony.
How do they control it? What do they do?
Well, they basically set the laws of like how to act, what to do, and basically they were like playing as the paternal figures to like Mexicans. They were the paternal figures, obviously, because that's what the clergy is. The clergy basically has to play the part as the paternal figure for their congregations,
Okay.
And so basically it was like that ever since Spain came over here to the Americas and they colonized the Americas. Church was the power source, with the crown behind them, and the crown was supporting, and the church were supporting each other and making sure things went smoothly, that they still maintained control of the lands that they had. And that's how it was until the War of Independence in the early 1800s, right?
You mentioned the crown being like when it was a monarchy in Mexico, or the crown is like
representing the crown, basically a representative of the crown, which was known as the virrey, or the viceroy.
Oh, okay.
So basically, you had viceroys placed within the colonies, or like in big area colonies, right? And basically these are representatives of the crown. They're physical, they are basically like the physical being of like the crown themselves. Representing the crown in Spain. And so the War of Independence happens starting in 1810, right?
Okay.
And then it goes all the way until 1821, where Mexico finally achieves their independence from Spain. And of course, the church is divided at this point between those fighting for independence, but with the loyalists, basically the royalists, who wants to make sure Spain holds Mexico as a colony. But eventually the rebels win, and everything does go well. I could say everything goes well because, of course, the leaders are Catholic. Obviously, like the new leaders are Catholic, and they want to make sure that Mexico at least becomes independent from Spain. like of course they're still going to rely on the church in some cases, in most cases, but of course the church are going to remind the new leaders like, hey, make sure you treat everyone that lives in this new country right still, etc., and all this, right? And all will be good. And of course there were some liberals, let's call them liberals because that's basically what it is. It's the age of liberalism at this point. There were some people in the government that was like, well, first of all, we have this amazing land in throughout Mexico, right? We have a vast amount of land, right? But it seems like the church has been hoarding the land for themselves and keeping the money for themselves and not wanting to share it with anyone else or want to give the money to the new government, right? They just care about giving the money to the church and all this, right? So of course the number one place in Mexico where there was a lot of lands that was owned by the church was of course Alta California, or in this case just plain old California, but back then it was known as Alta California when it was part of Mexico.
Oh.
So you have the missions in California, right? And they own a vast amount of land. Basically, the church owned all the land, even though there's like missions, like churches spread around. In reality, the church owned all of California, like all the land.
So that's what their argument was, is that the liberals were seeing that the church was hoarding all of this land that was up there. Okay.
Basically, in that, like, oh, we care about, liberty and freedom for all. So basically, what happened was in 1833, an act was passed. The Mexican government passed this act in 1833 that would basically transfer the mission lands and control from the Catholic Church to civil authority. So now the lands are no longer going to belong to the Catholic Church. They're now going to become under the authority of basically the government, under the government, basically. And the government will decide what to do with the lands, right? So basically, the government's aim, though, was to create towns for the Native Americans, but in the end, it resulted in land grabs by the Mexican elites, so like the upper class Mexicans.
So the natives at that point in time in those areas of Mexico, they didn't have a place within those towns that were owned by the church.
Basically, they were considered to be like residents of the missions.
Oh, but they didn't
have their own towns.
Okay.
So basically the Mexican government's idea was to create towns for the Native Americans, right?
So they didn't have
outside of church authority, right? It's like, okay, we want to make sure the Native Americans have their own town, right? Basically like their own town. They can
so they didn't have reservations in those towns.
Yeah,
and even then,
no reservations. Just like you can create a pueblo, like a normal pueblo, right? You can settle wherever.
They at this point, even with what they were aiming for, they didn't even get that either.
Nope. And that's what sucks because Mexican elites, like the military leaders or like lawyers or those in civil offices, they wanted to grab the land. So it's like, oh, free land, like more land. I want to be rich. So basically, after independence, the government of Mexico wanted to reduce the church's power in the land holdings. And then the land desire was basically from soldiers, rancheros, and settlers. They wanted to covet the rich mission lands for agricultural settlement because the missions actually did a good job with the lands. Because what was going on with the lands? Well, the mission basically had agriculture.
I mean, I would assume because if these missions are within the towns, they would have to be able to sustain themselves at some point, and because I'm assuming if that land is sacred to them, they would have some way of having sustainability with growing food and making sure the town at least survives at that point without relying too much on outside resources.
So the missions had agriculture, right? They had the biggest herds of cattle and sheep and horses, which basically, I believe, Mission San Luis Rey had like the largest herd of cows
Okay.
in the entire mission system.
Okay.
So basically, that's what it meant by like, oh, that they want that the soldiers, rancheros, and the settlers, they wanted to covet the rich mission lands, so that way they can take in charge of like the agriculture and like the herds and create settlements, right? So that way they can be more richer. They can profit for themselves. They were only focusing on their own interests.
So where does it leave the Native Americans at this point, since they were at this point being used for and just thrown on the wayside, instead of giving them their own like reservations and stuff?
Well, first of all, the land did intended to free the Native Americans in the first place. That was what the law was intended for. It was like, you're free, you are free from the church's authority. Go about and create your towns, do whatever, look for a profession that befits you. Basically, make money and make a living for yourself, right? Go ahead. And basically, it rarely happened, okay? So the decree of 1833 was the Mexican government passed a decree for the secularization of the missions of the Californias on August 17th of 1833. And then the regulations of 1834 was that California's governor implemented these with a provisional ordinance for the secularization of the missions in 1834, basically dealing with how the mission buildings should become town halls and schools, right? So you can keep the church, but the other buildings around it, we can turn them into like other uses, like such as making it into like a town hall or making it into a school, etc. And then the land distribution failure was, while provisions existed for land grants to Native Americans, most land and assets were instead given or sold to politically connected Mexican families. Right. So basically, even though it existed on paper, majority of the land and the assets that were there was given basically to the highest bidder, to the rich families of Mexico. And of course, one of the examples that we have here in California is the Estudillo family. The Estudillo family were basically a military family. I guess you could say the first founder of the family in the Mexican period, right? So the Estudillo, the Estudillo that was alive when Mexico finally achieved independence was actually a captain in the San Diego Presidio for the Spanish military. So basically, that family was given the lands that are current day San Diego, Imperial Valley, Riverside, and half of San Bernardino counties. So basically, they got the San Diego and the San Luis Rey lands.
What is that, like 6 of the 12 missions?
23.
6 out of the 23 missions?
What do you mean? There were 2 missions
that they have control over?
like the lands, basically.
Okay.
Like the lands. So you have missions.
Oh, so it's only 2 out of the
So it's San Diego and San Luis Rey. Like the lands that the mission had, that was their land now that they got him. So the consequences. So of course this brought an end to an era. By the late 1830s, the mission system was effectively dismantled and many missions would eventually fall into ruin, thus becoming ranchos or private property. And then it became a big loss for the natives, Native Americans unprepared for modern society and land ownership complexities, largely lost out on the intended benefits, often ending up as laborers on the ranchos or fleeing to the interior, right? So basically for the natives, it wasn't a good thing for them because they weren't prepared to assimilate into society, well, not society like that. I mean, they were assimilated, but they weren't able to take things into their own hands, I guess you could say. They weren't ready to take things into their own hands, I guess that's what it's saying.
Okay.
And so they ended up working for the rancheros. They ended up working for the families that ended up taking the land, ended up buying the lands. They ended up working for them instead. And then, of course, basically, that's one way that the Mexican government took power away from the church in the beginning, was the secularization of the missions.
Okay.
And putting them into like private assets of rich families.
Okay, so now they're losing land. Now, what are they going after this time? Or next, I should say.
So everything goes well in Mexico for a while. And basically it comes to 1857. So of course the church still has control of lands, but inside actual Mexico. So if you look at the actual map of Mexico, that area of Mexico today, the church still had lands right there, just not like up here in California anymore. So there was still land that the church had, and of course they still took some part within government affairs. And basically in comes the Constitution of 1857. So the Constitution of 1807 was a landmark liberal document establishing individual rights, so speech, press, assembly, a federal republic with separated powers, and secular principles, abolishing slavery and limiting church and military privileges. So it's a more I guess you could say it was a more radical continuation, I guess. They wanted to continue. They wanted to, and they also wanted to, how can I put it? They wanted to be in the same level as the United States, I guess you could say.
How?
With basically how how our government is set up.
So how are they going to achieve that with this constitution? How are you going to limit the church's influence on politics with what it's outlining? What are you limiting? How are you limiting their access to politics?
Basically, you just tell them straight out that they're not allowed to be in politics. Whatever happens with the church stays with the church, and whatever happens with the government stays with the government. It was like, as I guess you could say, just like put it that way. Like it was simple as that. It was like the church, okay, you do things your way, and then we do things our way. Like you're not allowed to interfere with Mexican politics, I guess you could say, like the state politics. The church has their own thing going on, but whatever we decide, it's for the benefit of the country instead.
So what's an example of that? Are you talking about like court related issues or?
So let's look at the courts, for example. So basically, the church and the military had their own courts specifically for them. So anything that happens within the church is tried by the church, and whatever happens with the military is tried. Anything that has to involve like a military personnel or someone, they're tried by the military. But the Constitution of 1857 basically said, no, you're not. Like you guys are like the church and the military. You guys are not allowed to have your own trials. Everyone has to be tried by like a set of judges from the state. So basically, it was a reforming thing, right? So, of course, modeled after the U.S. Constitution, created a federal republic with distinct executive, legislative, and judicial branch, giving power to the states, obviously. And then, basically, the secularization prohibited ecclesiastical property holding except for church buildings, and promoted free, non-dogmatic education, challenging the church's power, right? So this is another thing, right, where you take land from the church, but not their buildings. So buildings can belong to the church, but if you have like extra set of land that's not there, then the church has to give it up, basically. And of course, economic reforms, democratic reforms, right? And the conflict it had though was its liberal anti-clerical provisions were fiercely opposed by the conservatives, leading to the War of Reform from 1858 to 61, right? So the conservatives were the ones who were against this constitution, right? The conservatives viewed the constitution as being too anti-clerical.
Okay.
And so, you know, you have all that going on. Benito Juarez, who would be the future president in the 1860s, he was the one that took part in making a lot of these changes, basically, inside the Constitution. And of course, with the church, he was the one that did put some laws into it.
Like what?
So basically, Juarez ended up making this thing known as the Juarez Law, and basically it abolished the jurisdiction that the military and ecclesiastical courts had over purely civil cases, right? And basically the liberals criticized the existence of both of these courts were being biased towards their defendants. And in the case of the ecclesiastical courts, their jurisdiction extended even to tenants living on extensive church-owned land, and creditors could not sue such tenants in civil court. And then, of course, the conservatives accused the government of hypocrisy for acting on the pretext of establishing legal equality for all while maintaining the legal immunity that existed for members of the government.
So you couldn't sue the government if they decided to make this, if they allowed the government to make their, like, establish a non-biased court of law.
The liberals were accusing the church and the military that they were being biased, but mainly the church. They were accusing the church that they were biased towards the defendants.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like, so the government can say, yeah, you guys can't have your own courts, but then again, they can't. The government can't be sued themselves at that point for, you know, anything that happens in the legal system that reflects on them, I guess. I don't know if that's what it's implying at that point.
Basically, yeah. That's what he's basically trying to say. That Juarez was the one that wanted to basically make Mexico into what the United States is like. You know, everything is done civilly, not through a religious head or you know, religion, in a religious institution, right? Everything has to be done through the government. That included marriages, civil cases, like divorces, and anything that was deemed to have been the church's duty to look over. That now everyone, you give people a lot more freedom than they had than when they were with the church.
Right.
You know. So of course the conservatives still view this as anti-clerical. Basically like, oh well, you're attacking religion. Basically, you're attacking the church that was basically the fundamental foundations of Mexico. You know, it was a church that basically helped us achieve independence, because of course there's like people that were in the clergy that was help with the independence movement, right? And of course there's basically, what is it? the expulsion decree of church officials, by which the exile Luis Clemente, apostolic delegate, Archbishop Jose Lázaro de la Garza y Ballesteros, and Pedro Espinosa, bishops in Dávalos, and Pedro Moreno Barajas, and ordered. It was released in Mexico City on January 21st, 1861, right?
Okay.
So, yeah, so it also was allowed to expel church officials. I guess that the government was allowed to expel church officials.
Huh.
Decree of secularization of nuns and friars, by which throughout the republic cloisters and monasteries decreeing the exit of religious men and women living there, with the exception of the Sisters of Charity, died. Right. So Juarez basically passed all these laws that were aimed to limit the church's power more and more within Mexican civil life.
Okay.
Basically. So you have that, right? So we continue on and on, right? Throughout the 19th century, right? Everything seems to be fine for the most part until you reach to the 20th century, which basically means that there was a president in Mexico, Porfirio Diaz, who held power for like 30 years in Mexico. And, they were tired. Mexicans were tired of it. They were tired of him playing favorites, such as, giving free passes to his rich friends and not caring about the poor, etc.
Oh.
And basically, in comes the revolution of 1911. The revolution of 1911, where Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata took up arms within their different areas of Mexico to rebel against the government and overthrow Diaz from power. Right.
So, how did that end up going? Since they wanted to establish a coup and overthrow the government.
So, they obviously won. They overthrew Diaz, and basically they get into trying to modernize Mexico more and more, and basically they want to bring more liberal things within Mexico to try to make sure Mexicans have the necessity that they mean, such as freedom of religion, freedom of speech, etc. So of course you have a succession of presidents that ended up taking place throughout Mexico, right? So they took out Diaz at first, right?
Okay, so who's gonna take over?
So Porfirio Diaz was out of the book, right, already, and Francisco Madero becomes the next president, the 37th president of Mexico, right?
All right.
And then the revolutionaries didn't like him, so they oust him out, and they end up electing Pedro Lascurain, Pedro Lascurain, but he was only in office for 45 minutes.
Oh, 45 minutes. What do you mean?
Until it was done by a coup under Victoriano Huerta.
So a militarian took over?
Yeah, so a military guy took over, right? Victoriano Huerta.
And then what?
So we have him. He's only president for like 1 year, a little over a year. And then you have Francisco Cervajal.
Carvajal. Okay.
He's only president for a month.
A month?
In 1914, he's only president for a month.
So you say this is all happening as like during this whole revolution?
Yes.
Period of
So that
8
whole
years?
period is like a lot of changes within the Mexican leadership because it was just a lot of instability. The revolution sort of brought a lot of instability within the country. People were eyeing for power within Mexico. And it was mainly in the government level, not so much with the revolutionaries like Pancho Villa and Zapata, right? Not anyone from there, but the people that were like in supportive of the government.
Okay.
You know, they were fighting for power. And so in comes Eulalio Gutierrez, Roque Gonzalez Garza, and all these, oh my God, all these literally ended with, because these presidents were elected by the convention of Aguascalientes. Basically, the meeting that took place during the revolution that defeated Huerta's army and the government that Zapata and Villa placed.
Huh.
So it was just chaotic. And then you get to
Venustiano.
yeah, you get to Venustiano Carranza, who was basically, who of course took part in making the Constitution of 1917, the new Constitution of 1917.
Which was what?
So basically, the Constitution was to have been more liberal, right? It was supposed to implement the changes that were supposed to happen with the 1857 Constitution. It was basically like a relook of the 1857 Constitution, like, oh yeah, we're gonna add a few things here and there, right?
So it was never spelled out the first time around when they were making this?
Well, first of all, a lot of these things weren't like implemented. It was hard for them when the 1857 Constitution happened. It was kind of hard for them to implement certain things, like, well, for example, the church's power, right? Limiting the church's powers. Even though it was written on paper, they didn't really do much to bring it into its full
So how are they
potential.
enforcing it now since it wasn't fully enforced in 57?
So basically, it wasn't implemented still. So basically, when Carranza helped write this, right, with other people, the radicals established a more far-reaching reform of the relationship of church and state that was favored by Carranza, right? So Articles 3 and 130 were strongly anti-clerical. The Catholic Church in Mexico was denied recognition as a legal entity. Priests were denied various rights and subject to public registration. Religious education was forbidden. Public religious ritual outside of the churches was banned, and all churches were nationalized as the property of the nation.
Okay.
Basically. So I guess they wanted to try to get Rome's power, making sure Rome doesn't have as much power over the church in Mexico as the Mexican government should have, believed that they should have power over the church in Mexico.
Right.
Right. So basically, it was kind of dumb though. It's like, look, priests were denied various rights. Like, what? Well, that's kind of broad and subject to public registration. Religious education was forbidden. Okay, first of all, how are the kids are going to be educated about religion if you're going to forbid it? I mean, you have your public schools, but the church should also have had the right to have their branch of education as well.
Did they not have their, like, when they were making these towns, did they not have their own schools for them to say, like, oh, hey, like, we're going to be establishing this? And then when this came around, did they not have a school within the church itself where they could establish like, oh, we're gonna have religious education here before they modernize everything as public school and stuff like that? Because I don't understand. Because I'm like you. I'm like, why would you want to forbid religious education unless they were trying to teach that in public school when
Well, even
the
in
Constitution of 1857 was
okay,
going
well,
around?
basically, public education here in the United States brought religion into the education system too back then.
Yeah, but at that point, when they had created
afford
private
everyone.
schools like that were religious entities and stuff like that that they had control over, they could implement religious education. But
Yeah.
what you're saying
Because
here
before
is
the church was in charge of education, there was rarely any public schools in Mexico.
no, but that's what I'm saying. Like as far as what it's being defined in that article, I feel like it's kind of not specific as to forbidden where, like forbidden in public school, forbidden in their own church. At that point, that's kind of where
In
I'm getting
general,
that
I guess
confusion.
in general, religious education was forbidden in general. So I guess the church was no longer allowed to be involved in education.
All right.
Yeah, basically. And then public religious ritual outside the churches was banned. What do you mean? It's like, what do you mean religious rituals outside the churches were banned? It's like
Unless if they're talking about like
las ferias, like some of the ferias have religious rituals, and
but I mean, isn't that what you like mentioned before about how priests couldn't walk out in like their regular vestments outside of the church? They had to kind of just keep it within the boundaries of their property and stuff like that.
basically that's what it is. I guess that could be public religious ritual. Oh, so they couldn't basically celebrate mass outside. But I mean, there's other parts in our religion, the Catholic Church, where where religious rituals are made public anyways. Like, for example, like blessings, right? You have blessings, and you have processions of the sun, of like saints, or like the Santissimo, outside of the church. Obviously, they do processions and things like that. So I guess now they're saying like, oh yeah, you're no longer allowed to do that. Everything has to be within, like, inside the church. You can't do that outside. But honestly, that would have brought a lot of that would have brought a lot of sentiment with the people against the government, because for many this was like a way of life. When they do public religious rituals, right, on the days of a saint, a patron saint of their town, right, or even just like with the Santissimo, right, they do these processions and these fiestas, and it's like, oh, so now the government's telling us that we're not allowed to express our beliefs like during like these certain days,
Okay.
basically. So that's what that was one of. So this was like the few examples of like the anti-clerical laws that were made in 1917, and of course, I did mention this before, that Carranza supposedly said that he was a devout Catholic. Carranza, he says that he was a Catholic. Adolfo de la Huerta was Catholic. And then Alvaro Obregón, he was Catholic. But then we end up going to Plutarco Elias Calles.
The first non-Catholic.
Basically, like, you can call him like the first atheist president of Mexico. Yeah, like the first atheist president of Mexico. When he comes to power in 1924, he ends up implementing the 1917 Constitution. Like, he's a go-getter, I guess. He gets things done. He's like, you know what? I'm going to make this happen, okay? Because I'm seeing there's a lot of loopholes. There's a lot of things that aren't being fulfilled in the Constitution. So, you know what? This is going to happen right now. I am going to implement everything that's inside the Constitution. So, anti-clerical laws, Set him in motion.
Set in motion how? How are
So
you
basically, he closed down some of the churches.
closing down how? By just storming the churches?
The military. He would send them. He would send
The federals?
los federales, the federal soldiers, to like towns, places where religion was most convenient, or like places that wouldn't accept the conditions of the 1917 Constitution, right? He ends up sending soldiers to forcefully close down the churches. And of course, at this point, foreign priests were expelled, so no foreign priests were allowed to be in Mexico, which basically left a devastation on a lot of like towns that were left without a priest. So you had that, and then he basically wanted to make Mexico like more secular. He wants to make sure kids are learning science and not basically what religion tells them about science, which people don't know that the Catholic Church is a big supporter of science. They're basically the cheerleaders of science.
But only certain areas of science, not the entire breadth of what science entails.
Well, for example, evolution.
That's one topic that they don't like to talk about.
Yeah, evolution is a big.
That is a part of science.
Evolution's a big no, and it's been, so basically. So Caius basically implements this, and
he just wants some well-rounded education around here.
Well, yeah, I guess he wanted to make sure Mexico becomes more modern, like the other, all the other countries.
But I mean, there is a point to be made, I guess, not really saying in favor, but just to the point where what his agenda was for a more broader education, just so that people that succeed after him have a more political awareness of what's going around in the country as far as things that go that are happening, whereas the church would limit the amount of knowledge that goes beyond their jurisdiction in that sense. So that way the church doesn't have as much control as what ends up going out to the public at that point. So I can understand what that agenda is for education itself. But as far as the extent to like barging into the churches and doing what they need to do, I feel like that's the extent of it is a little too much to prove a point.
So basically, he made this thing known as the Gaius laws, because I guess every president has some form of laws now.
So what does this mean?
So it was to enforce restrictions against the church in Article 130 of the Mexican Constitution. So basically, this was specifically talking about Article 130 of the Constitution, right? To that end, it required that all churches and religious groups were to register with the state, and they placed restrictions on priests and ministers of all religions. Priests and ministers were prohibited from holding public office, canvassing on behalf of political parties or candidates, or inheriting property from persons other than close blood relatives. And then Gaius applied existing laws regarding separation of church and state, right?
Okay.
And then basically the law provided specific penalties for priests and individuals who violated Article 140. For example, wearing clerical garb in public was punishable by a fine of 500 pesos, which was approximately $250 at the time. Or back in 2010, it's worth 4,250.
All right.
So a fine of 500 pesos just for wearing your clerical garb in public.
which is
And then a priest who criticized the government could be imprisoned up to 5 years. So he was infringing the freedom of speech, basically. The freedom of speech, basically, because you are allowed to criticize your government. That's what the freedom of speech is all about.
So much for social reform.
Exactly.
So, like, you could say even a person who doesn't go to church is allowed to say anything they want, and they could face 5 years of imprisonment.
Well, this is specifically targeting like religious people. I mean, I guess they were more lenient towards like the lay people, you know, like the regular people. But like with like a priest or like a pastor, it's like, oh no, you're not allowed to criticize us. Like really 5 years. And in some states enacted further measures in the name of church and state separation. In Chihuahua, for example, enacting a law permitting only a single priest to serve the entire Catholic congregation of the state. What the? Chihuahua?
That's not to say how many churches.
One priest?
That's not to say how many churches they even have in the entire state of Chihuahua too. So that's
because Chihuahua's a big state.
I've never been to Chihuahua. So
if you look at pictures, it is mainly like, or is that Sonora where it's just desert?
I wouldn't know. I've never been to Chihuahua, so I cannot confirm nor deny what you're saying. So
well, I don't know Chihuahua either. I've never been to Chihuahua. Tabasco, so the state of Tabasco, on the other hand, introduced a law whereby all priests were required to be married to exercise their office. What the heck? To help enforce the law, Gaius seized church properties, expelled foreign priests, like I mentioned, and closed monasteries, convents, and religious schools. Oh, geez, monasteries and convents? So where the heck are people who got the single life, the religious life, gonna go?
Yeah.
It's like, this was like a full-on attack on the Catholic Church. The church saw the law as however, the church saw the law as a trap to conform the church to a tyrannical state. One result of the Gaius laws was, of course, a war that was going to happen that same year. A war that was a popular uprising of Catholic peasants in the regions of central Mexico. So that's basically like Aguascalientes, Jalisco, Michoacan, all the states that are in central Mexico against the federal government, right? So this is where I guess I'll leave off for now. So this ends part 1 of our Cristero War episode. So basically this was just a prequel, just an explanation about like the anti-clerical laws, or basically the prequel, basically like the background of how separation of church and state came to be in Mexico, and basically how the ordinary Mexicans were going to feel about that. And, for the next time, we're going to go into part 2, explaining about the war itself. So be prepared. You're going to get excited for that one because, there's a lot of things to go about it, right? A lot of interesting things that are going to happen. So until then, guys.
Well, this has been your host,
Martin
and Jose, and gracias as we take a drink with the past.